the details are still coming out. It looks like this was a ship in the area of Crimea that the Ukrainians have targeted. We don't currently have confirmation. The Ukrainians don't tend to confirm when they've struck these sorts of key Russian targets, and the Russians certainly don't tend to confirm when these sorts of targets are struck. But it looks like it may be a significant strike from the Ukrainian side that's quite desperate to show some progress after what has been a relatively slow-moving counteroffensive.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting to talk a little bit about what Zelensky wants from his new military chief. Of course, the old one was removed recently. What are his priorities, given, to your point, that they want to show that inroads are being made?
It's very important for the Ukrainians to show that they are making some gains on the battlefield. And the reason it's important is because they're trying quite desperately to secure aid to help them continue funding their defense effort against Russia, both from the US, where a very large aid package is currently stalled as a result of the Republican opposition to that in Congress, and in the EU, which has been rather slow at getting that aid package through because of opposition from Hungary. So any of these sorts of wins are really important for Ukraine to show that there's something that's being done with this Western money that's being funneled to it. The new Ukrainian general has been appointed seeking to shake things up because there has been a bit of a stall in the Ukrainian efforts. And so Zelensky has been hoping to really try something new, a new approach with this new leadership.
Yeah. Do they have the personnel with the right skills?
It's a tricky one because, of course, the Ukrainian side has been depleted, as have the Russians. So there is definitely a shortage of manpower, and that's something we're seeing the Ukrainians trying to cope with at the moment. There are talks about a new conscription effort and trying to get new additional people into the armed forces, and that's really a very controversial measure. And it's definitely something Ukraine is trying to deal with. They need to conserve their manpower because their population is significantly smaller than the Russian population.
Yeah. This aid package that we now see, it's through the Senate, but probably not likely to get through the House without some defections from the Republicans. Is this critical to Ukraine's ongoing fight? How, without it, what might it mean for this war?
It's absolutely critical. So we expect there might be a vote in the House on Friday, and the outcome of that vote is far from certain. Ukraine has a huge budget deficit. It really needs this money because it needs the money both to pay the salaries of its soldiers, of its fighters on the front line, but also to ensure that its public services continue running. And we mustn't forget that Ukraine has been in large swathes of land completely razed to the ground by the Russians. So they're also at the same time trying to rebuild cities in Ukrainian territory that have been destroyed. So it's a vital aid package. The Europeans have really stepped up, and they have recently passed their own 50 billion euro aid package, which is very significant for Ukraine. And the Europeans have said that they know that they need to step up. They're acknowledging the fact that there's a danger from a potential Trump presidency, as well as from this Republican hold on Congress, which means that Europe needs to step up and provide more of that funding. Ukraine was in a really desperate situation in January and February because they've really had a huge budget shortfall, but the money is expected to start flowing from the EU in March. And at that point, that should provide some sense of relief in Kyiv.
Yeah, so ironically, Donald Trump's protestations this week that could see other European countries quite vulnerable if he were to become president again might have spurred them on into some form of action.
It was certainly something that showed the European side, and I've been having these conversations with European diplomats and EU ministers. They are meeting today in the NATO alliance defense ministers began a meeting today in Brussels, and they'll continue meeting tomorrow. And this is the real topic of conversation on the table, that there is a real sense that with a potential Trump presidency returning and the potential that Trump might pull the US out of NATO, which is the indication that he's been giving since his first presidency, that is certainly something they're talking about and trying to deal with. So there's a real sense of urgency that the EU needs to do more to bump up its own defences.
Yeah. What is the likelihood, though, that they might look at sort of handing over parts of the money that has been held in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine for its war effort?
This is a move that's being made at the G7 and the EU level. So basically what's happened is that in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU and the US froze a large number of Russian central bank assets. And those assets have been sitting and essentially earning income, because that's billions and billions of dollars worth of assets. And so we think there's around about 4 billion euro in income generated from those assets just in the EU. And that is something that European countries are looking at using. So it's not that they're looking at using the actual money that is being set aside, but they're looking at using the proceeds of that money, which could be to the tune of around about 4 billion euro, at least in the EU side. That is moving forward. There was a key agreement reached in the European Council earlier this week that essentially was the first step towards that, but there's still a fair way to go before there is full agreement on what that package looks like and how the legal mechanisms work. Yeah. So it's probably a watch this space thing.
Terrific to see you, Zoya. Thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.